Today we're going to talk about a man named Irving Howbert. He was actually a soldier at Sand Creek, and on November 29, 1864, in Colorado Territory on Sand Creek, there was an event that many have claimed over the years was a massacre, but it was actually defended at the time by settlers in Colorado Territory and many of the soldiers at Sand Creek as a battle. And one of those that defended it as a battle was Irving Howbert. So we're going to talk about him today. We've got information we're taking from two books that he wrote. One is The Indians of the Pikes Peak region that he published in 1914, and the other is Memories of a Lifetime in the Pikes Peak region, and that was published in 1925. So we're going to talk about him today and just get kind of into talking about Irving Howbert. This is from our book. We found the Lost Sand Creek site. So we're going to be reading from our book today out of chapter 6. We've got an excerpt here about Irving Howbert, and this is in spring of 1860. 14-year-old Irving and his father, William, a Methodist minister, left their home in Quincy, Iowa, and headed for Denver, arriving 1 month later in June. He called Denver a small town made mostly of shacks. It left him disappointed. Shortly after arriving, his father met Reverend John M. Shivington, the presiding elder of the Methodist Church. Shivington appointed Reverend Howbert to take charge of a mission in Hamilton in the South Park area. Irving and his father brought his mother and sister back from Quincy in 1861. In October, they moved to their permanent home in Colorado City. He soon witnessed Indian trouble. Early in 1863, the Indians began to attack and rob wagon trains, steal horses, and threaten exposed settlements, but nothing occurred to cause any great alarm in the immediate Pikes Peak region until the spring of 1864, Irving Howbert said. One of the events Howbert describes is the murder of the Hungate family on June 11, 1864. The father and mother had been shot down and mutilated with horrible brutality, and the children who had tried to escape had been pursued and killed, so that not one of the family was left alive. This news made the people of Colorado City and the settlers along the Fountain and on the Divide very uneasy, and of course, after that, they were constantly on the lookout, not knowing where the savages might next appear. And so we get that information from Irving Howbert that we have, and we got that information from the books he wrote, straight directly from Irving. We'll also be reading directly from his books in this video. We find, though, he continues on, and Howbert talks about an acquaintance that he wrote about, and this acquaintance had claimed that he was the grandson of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. It's quite an interesting story, and we find that here. And we have this also in our book in chapter 6 of We Found the Lost Sand Creek site from Irving Howbert. A messenger arrived at Colorado City who had been sent by Governor Evans to warn the people of an impending attack by the Cheyennes and Arapahoes upon all settlements along the eastern frontier of Colorado. It appeared that the governor had received information from Elbridge Gerry, one of his secret agents, that 800 hostile Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors encamped at the Point of Rocks near the head of Beaver Creek in eastern Colorado had planned a simultaneous attack upon all the frontier settlements of Colorado from a point in the valley of the Platte River, 100 miles north of Denver, to the Arkansas River at the mouth of the Fontaine qui Boudier. According to the program agreed upon by the Indians, 100 warriors were to go to the valley of the Platte, 240 to the head of Cherry Creek, and the remainder of the 800 to the valleys of the Fountain and Arkansas rivers. Upon reaching the appointed localities, these parties were to be divided into small bands, each one of which was to attack a farmhouse, kill its occupants, loot the property, and run off stock. Elbridge Gerry, from whom the information of this proposed raid was received, was the grandson of the signer of the Declaration of Independence, and although an educated man, had lived with the Indians for a good many years and married a Cheyenne woman. At this time, he was living with his Indian wife on a stock ranch in the valley of the Platte River, 60 to 70 miles below Denver. It was here that the information reached him through two Cheyenne chiefs who came to warn him of the impending danger. Gary received the word about midnight and early the next morning started on horseback for Denver to notify Governor Evans, arriving there about 11 o'clock that night, having ridden the 60 or 70 miles without resting. The following day, small bands of Indians appeared along the whole eastern frontier of El Paso County, but their raid was a failure, as the warning given through the occurrence on Monument Creek and that sent by the governor had put everyone on guard. Consequently, the savages found that the settlers at every point either had fled or were ready to defend themselves. That the information given by Gary was absolutely correct was shown by the fact the Indians appeared at the appointed time along the entire frontier of Colorado, from the Platte to the Arkansas River. So one of the things we find about Irving Howbert is he writes about, he talks about by 1864 that there were numerous Indian raids and they were causing great harm to the people of Colorado Territory. He was quite aware of what was happening. And so he was intimately familiar with the Cheyenne attacking wagon trains and killing white settlers and scalping their white enemies and taking white captives. He was aware of everything that was happening. And all along the summer of 1864, and Governor John Evans of Colorado Territory, he made multiple requests to the government for help because of everything that was happening to the settlers in Colorado Territory. But because Colorado was just only a territory, he needed to get help from the government because they couldn't, they didn't have, an army of their own. They didn't have, anybody to fight on behalf of Colorado Territory. And unfortunately, what was happening is because the Civil War was still happening back east, there wasn't much help to send. And he says this: the governor had repeatedly called the attention of the general government to the helpless condition of our settlements and asked that government troops be sent to protect them from the raids of the Indians. But at this time, the entire military force of the nation was employed in suppressing the rebellion, and little aid could be given. It is true that the companies of the 1st Regiment of Colorado Cavalry were distributed along the frontier, seldom more than one company in a place. And so he talks about how he says little aid could be given. And so that's important. So Governor Evans made multiple requests. And after all of these requests, he was finally able to organize the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. And it was a 100-day regiment of volunteers. And they organized for the purpose of fighting back against the Indians. And one of the soldiers, Irving Howbert, he signed up to fight. He was only 18 years old when he signed up to fight with the Colorado 3rd Cavalry. And we find this in Irving Howbert's book, Memories of a Lifetime in the Pikes Peak region. We find that he wrote this: 2 or 3 weeks before we left camp, the company had been clothed in light blue uniforms, such as were then worn by the cavalry branch of the United States Army, and soon after our return, equipment of arms, ammunition, and the necessary accoutrement was issued. The guns given us were old, out-of-date Austrian muzzle-loading muskets of large bore, and our ammunition consisted of paper cartridges from which one had to bite off the end when loading. These guns sent a bullet rather viciously, but one could never tell where it would hit. A week or two later, our horses arrived. They were a motley looking group composed of every kind of equine animal, from pony to plow horse. The saddles and bridles were the same as those used by the regular cavalry service, and were good of their kind. I had the misfortune to draw a raw-boned, squarely built old plow horse, upon which I thereafter spent many uncomfortable hours. If the order came to trot, followed by an order to gallop, it took so long to get my steed well under way on a trot that he would be going like the wind before I could bring him to a gallop. Meanwhile, his rough trot would be shaking me to pieces. From what I have said, it will be understood that our equipment, as to arms and mounts, was of the poorest class, evidently from the reject of the armies in the East. And so we find there from Irving Howbert, so they assembled the Colorado Third. They were getting organized and getting, they're issued guns and horses. And he talks about the, horses, basically they were getting hand-me-downs for equipment. And Colorado Third wasn't given the best of stuff to fight with. But we talk and we learn about the forming of the Colorado Third. Um, and it's interesting to note because Irving Howbert is an important piece to the Sand Creek story. He's important to read and understand because he was an eyewitness. He was there. So we need to be able to look at people that were there to learn about that event. And Irving Howbert doesn't just give us information about the events and what happened at Sand Creek. He also gives clues to what might be found as an artifact, what might be found at Sand Creek. He gives some clues that way, and we just read about the horses and such, and there was a variety of horses, plow horses, and so you'd think though there'd be an assortment of horseshoes that might be found at the Sand Creek spot. Irving Howbert is also instrumental in something you may not be aware of. We're all aware of the event that happened at Sand Creek on November 29, 1864, but many of you may not be aware that where it's been alleged for that event to have happened uh, is actually not the right location. And Irving Howbert was incredibly instrumental in providing clues to finding Sand Creek artifacts. And so it's really interesting because, as we already read from our book, We Found the Lost Sand Creek Site. That book is a book about the discovery of the real location of Black Kettle's village and running battle areas. And we get a lot of information. Came from Irving Howbert for clues of where to search for artifacts. And so it's important to note that in the early 1990s, Chuck and Sherry Bowen, Chuck was leasing land from his parents on Sand Creek, and they were contacted by an independent archaeologist. And upon his studies, he had come to a conclusion that the monument at the time was owned by, was owned locally, but was now on land that is now managed by the National Park Service of the Sand Creek Historic Site. That the monument there that read Sand Creek Battleground, he believed that monument marked the wrong location. And he actually thought that the real location was further up the creek and possibly on the Bowen family ranch. So this kind of gets their thoughts going, thinking, well, if it's not there, maybe it could be on the Bowen family ranch. So that kind of gets that process going. And Irving Howbert was incredibly instrumental. He was a soldier at Sand Creek. He was well respected in his community, a pillar in the communities he lived in. And we'll talk more about him in this video and in upcoming videos as well. We'll talk more about Irving Howbert and how well respected he was. He was very well accomplished. So it's important to note Chuck grew up on that part of Sand Creek. And in fact, there was 7 miles of Sand Creek going through the Bowen family ranch. And his grandparents bought land on Sand Creek in 1948. His parents bought adjoining land on Sand Creek the next year. And that made then for 7 miles of Sand Creek going through the ranch. And he grew up there, and Sand Creek was literally his backyard. So he knew that land like the back of his hand, and nobody else knew that land more than him. And no one else has spent that much time or nearly as much time as him on that part of Sand Creek, not even close. And so this kind of got the the brain going, thinking, well, good grief, if this is not at the place where the monument sits, it could be possible that it was further up the creek. So you fast forward a couple years. In 1995, they decided they would develop a plan. Chuck would get a metal detector, and they would start looking for artifacts. And so they decided they needed to find clues for land descriptions, and so they could look for places to search with a metal detector. And so they decided the information they could trust would be from eyewitnesses. And the biggest eyewitness was Irving Howbert. He provided the best land descriptions as far as the land at Sand Creek. And so they would study Irving Howbert's books, look for those clues, and Chuck would go look and search those areas with a metal detector because they would read something and he would immediately recognize the part of Sand Creek they were talking about. He talked about how they got to a place where the banks were very wide, over 200 yards wide. And If you're familiar at all with the historic site that's managed by the National Park Service, the banks there are not very wide at all. They're nowhere close to being 200 yards wide, but you get up the creek, about 2 miles up the creek from that bluff, the creek widens out quite a bit, and it's easily 200 yards wide there. And another thing that caught their attention was, as I just mentioned, that bluff. There's a bluff there at the National Park Service site, and that's where they allege the Indians were camped and the soldiers attacked the village there. But interestingly, every single search that took place at that bluff at the NPS site has come up empty. No period artifact has ever been found below that bluff. Now, the National Park Service, they did do a search in 1999, and they did find a scattering of artifacts over a mile up the creek from there, but nothing found under the bluff where it's alleged the Indians were camped. If that was where they were camped, and this is indeed a massacre, and soldiers arrived and killed the Indians as they came out of their teepees, that place would have been littered with bullets, and it would have been littered with um, artifacts that would have been part of an Indian camp, such as like kettle fragments, coffee grinder parts, or even arrowheads, and not a single period artifact was ever found there. Irving Howbert provides one of the biggest clues of all, so we're going to read that in his book. We find this in Irving Howbert's book, Memories of a Lifetime, in the Pikes Peak region, and so he says this: just as the sun was coming up over the eastern horizon, we reached the top of a ridge, and away off down in the valley to the northwest, we saw a great number of Indian tents, forming a village of unusual size. We knew at once that this village was our objective point. Off to the left, between the place where we were and the village, there was a large number of Indian ponies scattered over the plain grazing. 2 or 3 minutes later, orders came directing our battalion to capture this herd. Under command of a major of the regiment, we started immediately on the run in order to get between the ponies and the Indian camp before our presence was discovered. But he says, away off down in the valley to the northwest, we saw a great number of Indian tents forming a village of unusual size. He actually gave a little bit more of a description as far as distance, and another comment that he said. Irving Howbert said this: at daylight in the morning, the command was 40 miles away from the fort. Just as the sun came up, the command reached the top of a ridge overlooking the valley of the Big Sandy, from which point a large Indian village could be seen scattered along the north bank of the stream about 3 miles away. So he says that when they reached the top of that ridge, that's where they first saw the Indian village. And he says they were scattered along the creek about 3 miles from there. Interestingly, as Irving Howbert said, he said they were camped about 3 miles up the creek from that bluff. And so interestingly, you get about a little over 2 miles up the creek from that bluff, or about 2 miles up the creek from there, and that's where Chuck started finding Sand Creek artifacts. That clue from Irving Howbert turned out to be the biggest clue of all, because that gave them a distance in knowing that they could, would want to start searching about a little over 2 to 3 miles up the creek from that bluff. He says this: after the engagement began, the Indian warriors concentrated along Sand Creek, using its high banks on both sides as a means of defense. Sand Creek at this point is about 200 yards wide, the banks on each side of which are almost perpendicular and from 6 to 12 feet high. The engagement later extended up this creek for 3 or 4 miles from the Indian encampment. Our capture of the ponies placed the savages at a great disadvantage, as an Indian is not accustomed to fighting on foot. The number of warriors in the village was about equal to our force, and had they been mounted, we would have great difficulty in defeating them, as they were better armed than we were, and the ponies were far superior for military purposes to the horses of our command. Throughout their engagement, our battery did effective work, its shells, as a rule, keeping the Indians from concentrating in considerable numbers at any single point. However, soon after the beginning of the fight, I saw a line of from 75 to 100 Indians gathered at one place, receive a charge as steadily as veterans, and their shooting was so effective that the soldiers were forced to fall back for a time. And so we see here from Irving Howbert that his command, his company, they're fighting bravely against the Indians, and the Indians are fighting bravely back. And he says though that they fought back hard, and but the soldiers had to stand their ground, and they kept fighting and they kept fighting. And he continues with this. But returning to the charge soon after, the troopers forced the Indians to retire behind the banks of the creek, which they did in leisurely manner, leaving a large number of their dead upon the field. The company to which I belonged became disorganized early in the fight, as did a number of others, and after that we fought in little groups wherever it seemed the most effective work could be done. After the first few shots at the beginning of the engagement, I had no fear whatever, nor did I see others displaying the least concern as to their own safety. The fight soon became general all up and down Sand Creek Valley, the Indians constantly firing from their places of defense along the stream, and a continuous fusillade being kept up by the soldiers, shooting at every Indian that came within range of their guns. I think it was in this way that some of the squaws were killed, as it was utterly impossible at a distance of 200 yards to distinguish between the sexes on account of similarity in their dress. And so we see here from Irving Howbert, he talks about how the Indians fought back, but the soldiers stood their ground and fought back harder, and were able to force the Indians back. And they were fighting warriors, is what he said. He even said that from a distance that that squaws would have been difficult to discern from the warriors. So that's idea that has been passed down for almost 160 years, that women were intentionally killed at Sand Creek, is just simply just not is unfounded. Irving Howbert talks about that this would have been difficult to tell the squaw from the warrior. And interestingly, Irving Howbert is not the only one to talk about this. Is in that Indian camp in Black Kettle's village was a half Cheyenne, a man named George Bent, who was actually an Indian warrior. They're known as dog soldiers. And George Bent wrote letters to historians many years after he was in the camp there at Sand Creek. And we'll talk about George Bent in a future video. So be on the lookout to hear us read George Bent's letters and his perspective on Sand Creek. But Irving Howbert, he talks about this not just as a fight, he defends Sand Creek as a battle, but not just as a battle. Irving Howbert defends Sand Creek as a running battle. I'm going to come back to this for just a moment. Irving Howbert says the fight soon became general all up and down Sand Creek Valley. So he's saying that this fighting is taking place all up and down the creek, in going along the creek and in multiple directions and in over miles. And this is the interesting thing is that over years of discovery, and so I have to come back to this discovery for a moment, because over the years it's been argued, whose side was correct. Was it the Indian side? Was it the soldier side? Is it, on the Indian side, it's claimed as a massacre, and how these soldiers stormed the village and they killed them as the Indians were camped below that bluff, and as they came out of their teepees very early that morning. And on the soldier side, it talks about a hard fought fight, and how the soldiers, they saw this village from this bluff um, about 3 miles up the creek from there. And so I come back to the discovery, and the reality is that bullets and arrowheads and battle items were found strung along the creek for several miles. There's running battle locations along Sand Creek that it goes for several miles and in multiple directions. And not just artifacts that were found, these bullets and arrowheads and other battle items. You're talking about military buttons and spurs and canteen stoppers and cone tinklers and arrowheads and lots of battle artifacts and Indian artifacts and soldier items, things that maybe they fell off of them. It's interesting because these artifacts show that the account from Irving Howbert was absolutely true. This engagement did go up and down Sand Creek, and it went up and down Sand Creek for several miles. And all of these artifacts were documented with GPS coordinates and a photo, so they were all documented meticulously. And it shows very clearly that Sand Creek was indeed a running battle. That's one thing is we can argue between soldiers and Indians on the different sides of the story. One thing that cannot lie is the physical evidence. The artifacts cannot lie. It is absolutely is concrete evidence. We can come back to this book that was written, um, over 100 years ago, and we can substantiate it with physical evidence. Some of the claims say that women and children were intentionally killed at Sand Creek. So it is important to note that Irving Howbert gave his account on this. Irving Howbert gave information about this, and this is going to be from his book, The Indians of the Pikes Peak Region. At one place, an Indian child, 3 or 4 years of age, ran out to us, holding up its hands and crying piteously. From its actions, we inferred that it wished to be taken up. At first, I was inclined to do so, but changed my mind when it occurred to me that I should have no means of taking care of the little fellow. We knew that there were Indians concealed within a couple of 100 yards of where we were, who certainly would take care of him as soon as we were out of the way. Consequently, we left him to be cared for by his own people. Every one of our party expressed sympathy for the little fellow, and no one dreamed of harming him. This is an important story to tell because we don't hear this story told with the official account of Sand Creek that's told um, by National Park Service or whoever else. We want to be truthful in telling Sand Creek based on eyewitness accounts and physical evidence because those two things go hand in hand. Those two things corroborate each other. The accounts of Irving Howbert talking about where this engagement took place and how long it stretched out for is substantiated by the physical evidence. So we have to take a careful look at what he said because we're told historically that these men of the Colorado Third were the worst of the worst, and they found just the most horrible people they could find, these barbaric men, and they rounded up all these scoundrels, all the worst they could find, and created the Colorado Third when that is not true. Irving Howbert gives a very detailed account here of seeing a child on the battleground, and they took pity on this child. They were not out in any way, shape, or form targeting children. Irving Howbert talks about this, and the majority of soldiers were like this. We're also transparent with Sand Creek, and yes, there is an account from Major Anthony who talks about how he saw a child intentionally killed at Sand Creek. But in all of our research, and my family has been researching and studying Sand Creek and searching for artifacts for 30 years. In all of these years, researching and studying Sand Creek, we only found that one account. So it's possible that other accounts like that happen, but we only found one. And we found this detailed account of Irving Howbert. It said everyone in his party had sympathy on this child. That's an important story to tell because most people do not know about that at Sand Creek. They're led to believe that it was the worst of the worst, when in fact, these were upstanding men in their community, pillars in their community. Irving Howbert was absolutely a pillar in his community. We'll talk more about him in a future video, but he was a founding father of Colorado Springs. He was, his father was a minister. He was a Christian man, and he did not go out there and target women, children, and elderly. That just simply is not the case. So it's interesting. We'll come back to this for a minute. Irving Howbert talks about that. Sand Creek was a running battle, and so we're told that these Indians were camped below this bluff. But it's important to note, as I said earlier in this video, no period artifacts have ever been found there. Skilled archaeologists have gone and searched below that bluff. Um, they went for multiple summers. There was a man that found hundreds of artifacts at the Summit Springs site in Sterling, Colorado. He was among this team that searched meticulously with metal detectors for artifacts below this bluff. They didn't find anything but the pop can tabs from like soda cans. They found barbed wire, fence staples, things from like ranching activity. They didn't find a single period artifact, not one. That is telling. That is not in the favor of the alleged massacre. The location is absolutely debunked. We know that through the artifacts that were found, that the Indians were indeed not camped below that bluff, but further up the creek And this doesn't just simply change the location, it changes the story. Because as Irving Howbert said, this engagement went on up and down Sand Creek. And it went up and down Sand Creek and for several miles and in multiple directions. It's corroborated by physical evidence by over 4,000 village and battle artifacts that were found that show that the village was actually not only was there a village area and battle area, they're two different locations. The village area, it starts just about 2 miles up the creek from that bluff and extends for about 2 to 3 miles. But interestingly, there was very little fighting that took place in the village. There was one teepee site that had a lot of bullets around it, and we can talk about this possibly in another video. Is that it's been said historically that Black Kettle stayed, and so there were some other Indians that stayed in the village and they took refuge at his teepee. So there was more gunfire there, but most of the Indians had actually fled the village. And we'll get into this in our videos about George Bent, but they had fled the village, and so the battle areas and the village areas are in different locations. And so we see that this was indeed a running battle because the physical evidence just doesn't exist for battle artifacts in the village. They're in a different spot. And immediately where the village is on the opposite side of the creek, that's where a lot of the battle artifacts started to be found. And that extended up the creek for several miles and then back across what would be on the same side of the creek from the village, but miles away from the village. And so that's important to note. Irving Howbert is an eyewitness. None of us were at Sand Creek. Irving Howbert was there. He fought there. He's just 18 years old. He went and valiantly fought against Indian warriors at Sand Creek, as we read about earlier. And so we're going to have a second part about Irving Howbert in an upcoming video. We'll talk about what he accomplished. We'll talk about more of what he said and defended about Sand Creek. And we're going to talk about Irving Howbert as a man, how well respected he was. This guy was not the worst of the worst. He was a pillar in his community, a good, upstanding Christian man that gives an honest account, because we take a good, hard look at what he says about the events at Sand Creek, because what he described as where Sand Creek took place is spot on. It's absolutely correct. And so we have to look at everything he said and take that as the truth. And so we'll talk more about Irving Howbert. We're going to talk about George Bent in a future video, and there's some other soldiers that we're going to look into in future videos as well. So make sure you subscribe to our channel here on YouTube. You go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, so that when we post new videos, you get notified of when those videos are uploaded. And go ahead and follow us as well on Facebook. It's facebook.com/Bowen History. And also make sure you go to our website, thelostsandcreek.com. Make sure you look at our blogs. We've got over 20 pages of blogs on our website. We've got videos. We've got other videos here on this channel. We've got metal detecting videos, and we've got short films that you're going to want to watch that are on our channel. We've got a video about James Carr. He was a soldier at Sand Creek, and it's about his letter that he writes about finding his friend that was killed at Sand Creek. So make sure you look for the James Carr letter video here on YouTube. And we have another short film here on YouTube about the Water Valley Schoolhouse and the Water Valley townsite and its connection to our Sand Creek discovery. So make sure, please subscribe to our channel, follow on Facebook at Bowen History, and check out our website, thelostsandcreek.com.